So thank you for joining us on a Friday the 13th in CSC 243, Digital Communications and Networking. We want to start off our session with drawing some attention to the Module 1 header or cover page. And essentially, when you look down to complete the activities, oh, that shouldn't be in there. That should be highlighted. Hang on just a second. I'm going to pause this. So now that we've resolved that, I'm going to leave this series highlighted just for the first module. What you see here is the sequence of activities, and I would call them deliverables. So in CSC 420, we're working a team sport, software engineering. It's the capstone course for our computer science degree. And we use the term deliverables in the workplace. I come to you from 25 years of experience in information technology and cybersecurity and healthcare IT and other contexts. And basically, these are the things that we expect you to submit by a certain deadline. So when you're submitting proof of purchase for the textbook, all you're doing, I'll post an assignment inside the module. So you'll see a 1.1 assignment, and it'll have the same title and the same date. And basically, all you do is make arrangements to rent or own the Comer textbook. You can get it on Kindle, but you open the table of contents and capture a screen, and you're good to go. Okay. Now, I need to clearly see in your capture for that textbook purchase, I need to see your name somewhere on the screen, either with the Kindle login or with the Vital Source login or something like that. You can go to Amazon, display the table of contents, and basically get over, and that's not going to help you. This is an optional assignment. So if you blow it off, it's not like it's going to prevent you from getting 100%. And if you fulfill all the other criteria and score full credit on all assignment solutions and assessments, including the final exams and midterm exams. So, but I did want everybody to be intentional about getting that textbook in front of you. Why? In addition to the study guide, you want to be able to read the first 2 chapters and sections 2 and 3 of chapter 13. And you want to do that fairly quickly. On Monday, I'll be reviewing details about how to complete an article review for those of you who have not submitted an article review previously. But can I ask someone in the class at this time, what's the main topic of this course? What's the main title of this course? Anyone?
Networking, digital
networking,
communications, and networking.
Yes, networking. So when you find an online article or a journal article, it needs to be about what? Networking or networks. Please don't reuse article assignments from previous courses. That gets a little sticky. That'll be due by the end of next week. Now, I am changing my convention for deadlines from previous seasons. And I want to be sure we clarify this. Except where there's a time specified, when I say due by Saturday, 14 January 2023, you have until 11:59 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time, which is our time zone. Okay. We have some students that travel to the mainland and so on, but basically we're talking about 11:59 p.m. on that day. Okay. So that's a change. Instead of specifying 11:59, it's just shorter and more efficient. What do you need to know about deadlines that include a time. Those are solid, in rock, hard concrete, inflexible. I will not extend them. I've been generous in previous classes with that, but it came back to haunt me. For certain assignments or assessments, we really need everybody to hold the line. So you'll start to get reminders, and I will send you a second and third notice that says, this is your last chance to make your first attempt at the module assessment. And if you don't complete it, it's a permanent zero. You don't get an extension. You don't get to, I'm just saying, that's created all sorts of headaches. And I got beat up on my student evaluations for the course. It's like, oh, it took longer for us to get our grades back. Well, I kept extending the deadlines based on student request, right? So there were delays in return. What we're going to do, though, most importantly, we want to review on Monday, 23 January 2023, when we start our class on Monday, not this Monday, but the following Monday. We want to take a look at this particular assessment, and we're going to do an item analysis. Okay, I'm sorry, the solution is due on Monday, and we want to take a look at it and call out some specifics about the solution that you need to know for your assessment, your first attempt of the module assessment. Now, once again, the focus in this course is mastery learning. So the details in the study guide you have to memorize. Not read, not skim, not reference during the assessment for the first time. You have to scour that because I take everything from the textbook and then condense that into the most important things that we want you to master. And that's simply not possible if students don't invest a minimum amount of time and energy covering that. So if you haven't read the study guide yet, when you're reading the textbook, that's where you can scan more, right? And especially the slides, those are good reference points and they're good to help clarify things. But we want the solution due by 11 a.m. Monday, because we're going to be calling out some things in class that you need to know that are going to be embedded as items for the assessment that's due on Wednesday. By 11 a.m. Wednesday, we're going to review those assessment items. We're going to perform an item analysis and see if there were any problem items. Sometimes we write those off. We post credit for students. If there's a question that everybody missed, we make sure it wasn't something they missed because the question was unclear, or there was a mistake, or there were graphics that were missing. So that's another reason why we do the item analysis. You'll notice that later that week, that same week, I'm going to adjust that. Later that same week, that should read 28. That should read 28 January. You will need to have the reconciliation submitted. So as you make errors on your assessment items, you're given the opportunity to earn additional credit by simply correcting those mistakes. And then you retake the assessment. There's a final version of the assessment that's due sometime later. And what we want to do is make sure that people, while the trail is fresh, while the content is in mind, we want people to make that final attempt. If we wait, now I have offered students the option, and we can do this now, or we can vote on Monday. I'll give you anonymous voting on screen. As a class, you can choose to simply do the reconciliation and wait on the retakes until right before the cumulative exams. So right before midterms and right before finals at the end of the course, you can refresh the trail with the reconciliations, retake the final version of the assessment right before the midterm. And modules 4, 5, and 6, right before the final exam. Those final versions of the module assessments are pretty much like a preview of coming attractions for the cumulative exam. Exams are conducted under exam conditions. They are not intended to be open book. They are not intended to be reconciled. So put another way, when you're working assessments in the modules and the goal is to master the material, the reconciliation and assessments are really for you. So that when you perform the retake on that final version, you're as far along in your understanding for that content as you can. Okay, that's the intent. And the assessments for the module are really for your benefit. That's why we do the item analysis. That's why we allow you to reconcile errors. Okay. The cumulative exams are for me, the instructor, because we need to determine what in our course is sticking. What is it that you're retaining? What is it that you've truly mastered? If there's a little bit of pressure and you have to respond quickly, do you really know something? And that's the purpose of the examinations, the cumulatives. So when you read the syllabus, the references, yeah, module assessments are formative. That means we're helping you form and develop your knowledge base, right? And then the cumulative exams are summative. That means we're taking stock or getting a read on the total or whole of your understanding at a certain point. I just thought I would clarify those terms and those criteria specifically while we had the chance. In any case, once again, that's going to read 28 January. The activities and assignments, the solution, the assessment, all of this is designed to be completed in sequence. One pitfall from some students is that they'll skip over and then they'll kind of cherry pick. I don't recommend that. Are there any questions about the sequence of activities for Module 1 before we go on with content? Any questions or comments?
For the textbook, could you make a slight edit and just say extra credit since it's not necessarily due?
Okay. How about if I do this? How's that?
Yeah, that works. Yeah.
Does that work? Okay. All right. Well, I think what I meant to do before was meant to pick black font and I clicked the wrong button. All right, we're good. Thank you for asking that question. Now, whenever we can accommodate a student interest, we will. And there are times I will tell you, it's good if a student emails me and says, hey, I need a little more time to complete the solution. So solutions are hands-on and there's a little more wiggle room with solutions, okay? You do want to complete the solution before each assessment attempt, if at all possible. Certainly by the final attempt. If you haven't completed the solution is where you get to use and practice the concepts and methods instead of just reading about them. And the scores people get when they take the assessment after the solution are dramatically higher. The scores after people do reconciliation properly, and we'll talk about what that means the first time we do a reconciliation. The scores are dramatically higher for the assessment retake. You'll notice that we drop the lower assessment score. So what will happen is that your score will go up for the course and then it'll go down because we'll take the lowest of the two scores between the two attempts and zero the lowest one out. Regardless, you still get credit for your reconciliation. In rare cases where students miss their first attempt, what we can do is allow that student to take the retake. It's only one shot they have, and they can reconcile based on the mistakes and errors in the final version of the assessment. So that is one thing that comes up each season as well. It's like, hey, I had a life happens. I had a traffic accident. I had an hour blocked out, and then I spent the rest of the morning getting a tow truck and filing a police report, right? And those things do happen. So we get it. I just can't hold up the whole class anymore to let people, you know, oh, I have some stuff I got to do. No, I can't do that anymore. I, but what I can do is work with you to finish. So I don't want anybody to think that if you don't get something finished, or if you see a zero, that you can't resubmit later in most cases. Okay. That is something we wanted to tackle. Now, we were in our last class uh, looking into the communications history and the purpose of the internet and how and why it evolved. And there's some extra materials in the resources folder that are absolutely critical. They're really important for you to reference. And what do I mean by that? Inside the resources folder, there's some extra recordings and such. You'll see this reference for GRC Shields Up. That's something that we're gonna do later in our session. But the links, if you see links, you need to click the links. And we did talk about what to do in case a link is broken or it doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
Didn't I talk about that already? Okay. All right, good. All right, so without further ado, so we were talking about Morse code and then voice communications and how you had to have an entire physical circuit of copper wire from the location of the caller all the way to the person receiving the call on the other end. And so if you look at, and I'm gonna do this here. Let's go to Google. So if you look at a map of the United States, and let's look at a map. Oh, no, that's not what I want. This used to come right up. There we go. All right. Everybody with me? That's as big as
Yes.
it's really.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so everybody understands that traditional telephones had to create connections. So if we're down here in the lower right corner, east and south of Cuba, right? And you place a call to somebody in Miami, the copper wire has to be connected all the way out to Miami and all the way back. There's actually two wires. It has to be a complete electrical circuit so that people can talk and hear. Otherwise, you can only talk or only hear. It has to be two-way, so there has to be a loop, right? You have to have a complete loop in order to have a circuit. In early times, there were major metro areas like St. Louis, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Denver, where the copper wires for telephone calls would all come together. These were called switching. So these were switching offices, right? So there would be huge telephone warehouses with sophisticated equipment. And at first it was actually physical. The connections were physically made. So if you called from the Virgin Islands down here over here to Los Angeles, you had to connect to Miami, then you had to connect to St. Louis, then you had to connect to Albuquerque, then you had to connect to Los Angeles. And at each one of those switching locations, the next part of the loop would be formed, right? So switching was an important aspect of this, right? Now, that created a problem during the Cold War. So one of the vulnerabilities that we learned after World War II, there was an arms race between Russia and the United States. Has anyone ever heard of this?
Yeah.
Yes.
in terms of world history. So Russia, it was kind of like divide the world up. At the end of World War II, there were two superpowers, Russia and the United States. And the United States had just used a nuclear weapon in Japan. And for those of you that are uninitiated about how evil that was, or whether that was ethical to do, the president who assumed command as commander-in-chief of the US Armed Forces after Roosevelt died. So our president died in the middle of world, at the end of World War II. And a man by the name of Harry Truman took the Oval Office. And Harry Truman was a character. But his military experts told him, based on what they know with the Japanese and the island warfare in the Pacific, that when the army got to the Japanese main island, it would cost between 10 and 20 million civilian losses. Everybody knows that the Japanese citizens, many of them, they basically learn and know and use martial arts, right? Everybody knows this? Most everybody knows this? Now that's a stereotype, but the point is that martial arts is a thing in Japan. It's a big thing in Japan. And if somebody has nothing other than a stick, they can do a whole lot with it, right? The truth is that Japanese soldiers and Japanese civilians were, they were very serious adversaries. And based on what they had learned when they were trying to conquer this Pacific back from the Japanese, they said, it's going to cost us 500,000 troops of our own and 10 to 20 million civilians with conventional methods. That's when Harry Truman said, you know, if we just shock them, let's nuke 2 cities. And we'll give them a chance to surrender after the first one. And the emperor, who was considered a god by his people, didn't surrender soon enough. So they dropped the first bomb, and the emperor of Japan could have surrendered, but he didn't. I don't know if anybody's ever talked to you about this, but it's the truth, and it's the truth will set you free. And a lot of people don't, you know, a lot of people think America is evil because we used a nuclear weapon. No, we were the first to use a nuclear weapon, but we did it to save lives. And that sounds weird, but that's the truth. So after that first detonation, they dropped a second bomb, and, you know, America said, okay, are we going to keep doing this, or are you going to surrender? And eventually, after the second bomb, the emperor said, okay, we're done. We're not going to do this. At which point the Japanese civilians learned that their emperor was not a god. Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth right now? There are people in this world that think they're all that, and they're evil, and they don't mind hurting people, right? And that's the reality. Well, we had nuclear weapons. Within 4 years, Russia developed their own nuclear weapons. And one of the things that they had learned early on was this concept of mutual assured destruction. It started an arms race. So America got more nuclear bombs, and then eventually missiles, and then later after that, nuclear submarines that could launch missiles from underwater locations. And Russia did the same. And what they did was they built up a nuclear arsenal so that if any one of the superpowers attacked the other superpower first, there would be enough left over for the first victim to turn around and obliterate the attacker. So Russia would never attack America because, and the other thing was they realized Russia had developed some weapons, and the United States Department of Defense realized if we drop an A-bomb on Los Angeles, Denver, St. Louis, Chicago, Atlanta, Miami, DC, Philadelphia, New York, what happens to the phone system? What do you think happens to all the phones and all the homes and all the businesses and all the companies in all of the shopping malls?
Don't work anymore.
They stop working. All of them stop working. So we discovered that there were scenarios in that arms race that weren't very good. And what we realized is that our current telephone system, plain old telephone system, was inadequate to protect us if the Russians ever launched a preemptive nuclear strike. They would have the advantage because, well, let's face it, in Russia, they were behind the times. They didn't have telephones everywhere, but we did. And we depended on our telephone system to conduct business, to secure our country, to do all sorts of things, right? To govern our people. And if you take out the telephones, well, now you have chaos. Now you have easy pickings. You can just come in and take over the world. And actually, there were plans. In fact, there have been a lot of very evil plans by both superpowers for how best to upend the other. The simple truth is that they realized that networks had to change. And this is what led to the internet. Now, I did want to take a quick moment to take that whole Morse code concept and develop it a little further. Any questions about mutual assured destruction and nuclear weapons and all that? So when you have copper wire and you have sound, it creates a wave over that wire. And what scientists realized is that kind of like the beats of a drum, right? Kind of like Morse code. If you take the peaks and the valleys, those can represent on and off. And they began to understand that there's a digital way to represent characters of the alphabet, numbers, symbols, information. And it wasn't long before they realized, oh, you can actually represent sound, video, any kind of information with ones and zeros. And the trick was to use the signals on the wire and basically to use the signal to generate a pulse that represented the one, and then either another type of pulse or no pulse at all to represent the zero. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I'm oversimplifying here, and there are some, well, there are some computer engineers in IEEE that would say, well, yeah, that's really oversimplified. But that's kind of like what we're doing here. And when you get into the real physics of it, that's really not that far-fetched. So that explanation is a simple version of what a scientist would relate, but there you have it. Okay, so the on and off or bits of a digital communication traveling with the same signal do not require amplification. So here's another thing that happened, and this was crazy. But when you had copper wire and you were using voice over that wire, they had to have amplifiers all along the way. So they didn't just have to have wires, they had to have amplifiers to boost the signal at each hop, at each step of the way for that connection. Those amplifiers, because the signal gets weaker and weaker and weaker. Over a distance, it's not so obvious. It's more shallow. The hills, the pulse isn't as strong, the curve isn't as high, and the valley isn't as low. And sooner or later, what happens is that it's harder to figure out where are the ones and where are the zeros. But if you use a binary approach to it, as the signal fades, you can still make out, okay, here's a 1, here's a 0, here's a 1, here's a 0. So there were strong advantages to using a digital way to represent information instead of the actual voice signal carried analog over the copper media, right? In the 1960s, the US and Russia were embroiled in this conflict known as the Cold War. And I've just explained all this. But the US government had a special secret project. Everybody's seen MIB, right? Men in Black?
Yep.
MIB, right? Did you know that our government has stuff like that for real? That's not just Hollywood.
Yeah, like what is it? MK Ultra? They
Oh,
did
yeah.
that.
Oh, yeah.
LSD.
Oh, yeah. And Area 51 is actually a real place. But the federal government, the Department of Defense in particular, defense, so they had a DOD, Department of Defense, Advanced Research Projects Agency. Now the advanced, it's called ARPA. Now, because it was the Department of Defense that was the lead agency for this, it's often called DARPA. It's either acronym you see out in there. So DARPA or ARPA, they developed a way to distribute the networks, right? So when I talked about circuits, the old school way of doing telecommunications to connect a single continuous loop of copper wire to build a circuit, that's called a circuit switched network. But ARPA figured out, you know what? We can use those ones and zeros, and we can bundle the ones and zeros together to create something called packets, chunks of digital information. Packets are chunks of ones and zeros. Now, again, I'm relating the simple version of this, but essentially, when you distribute the networks and you interconnect everything, and then you use chunks of digital information, let's take a look at what that looks like now. So instead of connecting a circuit with a continuous loop of copper wire, what we're saying is that ARPA discovered we're going to build network connections everywhere. It's going to look like a giant cobweb, a giant spider web. And then we're going to take the information we need to communicate and we convert it to ones and zeros and chunk it up together into packets. And one of the packets of an email message can go through Miami to DC to Chicago to Denver to LA. The same email message, just another packet of the same email message, can also be routed through Atlanta, New Orleans, Houston, Albuquerque, and Los Angeles. Put another way, when you chunk up ones and zeros, each of those packets can travel a different route across the cobweb to get to the other side. And when they get to the other side, the packets are reassembled in their original order. The packets are put back together again in the original sequence and order. Now, what does that mean if you're a nuclear weapons user in Russia? Well, you're screwed, because what it means is that you really have to just nuke everything. You just have to lift the entire surface of the United States of America off the planet of Earth, right? And that's going to cause a problem. That's really hard to defeat. So if you take out St. Louis, it doesn't matter. All those packets go different parts of the cobweb. It still gets to Los Angeles. You can take out all those major cities, and as long as you have part of the web left, you can still get that message through. But then they realized, wait a minute, this has practical applications for the rest of the world. And so that's what led to the internet. The important thing to understand are these two terms: circuit switched, that's old school POTS. And then you have the packet switched networks. That's the beginning of our modern internet, okay? When you take a bunch of cobweb networks and you interconnect them, you have an internetwork protocol and you have an internet. And there you have the origins of that term. Everybody get it? Now, I want to talk to you about a matter that's considered good form. I would be remiss in my duties as your instructor, as a professor here, if I didn't point out that when we write the word internet, it must be capitalized. Now, there are other cases where we're talking about interconnecting networks and we use the term internet, and that isn't the internet, global, worldwide. It is one of many internets or interconnected networks. So when you see internet, when it's not capitalized, the reference is, okay, we have a bunch of local networks and they're all interconnected. But it's not the global worldwide internet. When you say, I'm talking about the World Wide Web and the global network, the global public network, that is always capitalized. It is a proper noun. And I don't want to argue with people who are English majors or that's happened in previous semesters, believe it or not. People are like, well, languages are fluid and this is what the abridged dictionary, and I'm not going to argue that point. I'm just not. If you say this, you're talking about the whole planet. If you're talking about this, you're talking about smaller networks that are tied together. And you need to articulate and express yourself as a student of networking appropriately, or they're going to consider you to be a novice, a noob. So don't make that mistake, okay? And when you do your article review, I don't want a single student in my class to use the term internet when it means the global public IP network and fail to capitalize it. I'm just saying, because we've gone to a lot of trouble to explain that. It's considered good form to get that piece of it right. And so now you know that piece of it, okay? Any questions before we go on? All right, so we're going to pick up the pace now. So what you have is that originally the telecommunications network was all about hardware. It was all about physical connections. But eventually, because of the ones and zeros, computer science and programming and applications became a thing, right? So when you develop software now, you have individual devices and systems. You also hear the term cloud. So cloud is another way. You have public clouds, meaning the internet. You have private clouds, okay? It is important, and every time you see the word important, you need to make sure that you read that, right? So digital or data communications refers to the flows of ones and zeros between hardware components in the same device. Let me say that again. Digital communications, we're talking about the flow of ones and zeros inside a box, inside a system. When we talk about networking, we are talking about the flow of ones and zeros between systems, outside of and between systems, okay? And because there's a physical component that connects directly to the media, this is often referred to as the interface. So there's a physical connection from the circuit board to the wire or wireless, and that point of connection is called the interface, right? It's where the signal originates and is received to and from the components that transmit and receive, okay? And the substance that's used to send the signals, whether it is wire or it is fiber or it is radio, which we call Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is radio. That's all it is. Wi-Fi is radio. Same thing that transmits public television signals, radio and TV, right? Just remember that the physical media is what transmits the ones and zeros. Now, the rules of the transmission to send and receive signals over that are distinctly different from those that manage the packets of binary that flow over or on top of the signals. So you have signals over media, and then you have packets over signals. And then if you keep going, it's kind of a pattern. You have layers, okay? Layers. The working pieces of a, so when you have the means to organize those ones and zeros, those packets and signals, this is physical layer, this is a higher layer, of the rules. Those rules and methods for organizing the packets are called a protocol formally. So networking protocol is a series of rules and methods for how to organize the signals on the lower physical layers, and then how to put the packets on top of those signals at a higher layer, right? And so what you have are these layers that are often called a stack, a protocol stack. So you have different levels of protocols or layers of protocols. Networking is very much like ogres. Do we have any Shrek fans out there in the audience today?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And in the very
Shrek
first
is-
Shrek movie, he's talking to Donkey after he first meets Donkey, and he's like, ogres have layers like onions, right? Same kind of thing. All right. The working pieces of a protocol, what some call the functional criteria, can be loosely organized into two main types of rules: those that define syntax and those that define semantics. And you got to see slide 26 for more details. So if you go in here and then you go to there and you put in 26 and you hit enter, syntax, right? It has to do with how you format each of the messages, how you represent the data items with those ones and zeros, and how those ones and zeros are encoded into the signals. That's syntax. Semantics have to do with the meaning of each message. So the ones and zeros are used to represent certain things. That has to do with semantics. And so those parts of the protocol that are defined as semantics have to do with how you create a message to transmit meaning, and then the procedures that you use to exchange messages so you don't get the wrong message. And then actions to take when an error occurs. What happens if you get the wrong message? What happens if you want to check to make sure you got the right message? Meaning and corrections, that all has to do with semantics. At this point, we're going to stop today. We're at the end of our class. I promised we would track so that you can track with the listed schedule. So if you have another class, you can get there in time. Are there any questions before we close today?